Luis. When we talk about learning English as a second language, people often emphasize grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, but there's one area that tends to be completely overlooked. Even though it plays a massive role in how we connect with people in real conversations. And that's the art of asking questions, not just grammatically correct questions, but ones that sound natural, polite, and appropriate depending on who you're speaking to, where you are, and what the context is.
Exactly, Tuna. And the truth is, a lot of learners focus so much on getting their tenses right or memorizing hundreds of words. But when it comes to something as simple as asking a stranger a question, they freeze or sound too direct, too casual, or even unintentionally rude, and that's not because they don't know how to form a question. It's because they haven't yet learned how to soften the tone, how to frame the question in a way that feels respectful, especially in English-speaking cultures where manners are very much encoded into the language itself.
So today, let's go deep into this topic, not just giving a list of polite expressions, but truly understanding why certain questions feel natural and others don't, and how we can train ourselves to become more emotionally intelligent speakers in English. Starting with real-life examples that every learner can relate to and apply immediately in their day-to-day conversations.
Let's begin with the basics. Because sometimes even the most common questions can be problematic if we don't use the right tone. For example, take the question, "What's your name?" Yes, it's grammatically perfect, and yes, it's commonly used. But in a formal situation or with someone you've just met, especially in Western culture, it might come off a bit too abrupt, as though you're demanding information rather than initiating friendly conversation.
Exactly, and a more polite and socially graceful way to ask the same thing would be something like, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name earlier, may I ask what it is?" Or even, "I don't think we've been properly introduced, my name's Tuna. And you are?" Both of these versions not only convey the same message but also create a warmer and more respectful atmosphere.
And that brings us to a fundamental principle in asking questions politely in English. It's about adding small elements, words like, "Would you mind?" "Do you happen to know?" "If it's okay, I was wondering." These small phrases are what we call softeners, and they can completely change the way a question is received.
For instance, let's say you want to ask someone where they're from. If you just say, "Where are you from?" it might sound fine among friends. But with a stranger, especially in multicultural settings, it can come off as a bit intrusive or even judgmental depending on their background or past experiences.
Right. So instead, we could say something like, "If you don't mind me asking, where do you originally come from?" Or even, "Can I ask which part of the world you call home?" Both versions add a respectful distance and make it clear you're genuinely curious, not interrogating them.
Another common area where learners struggle is asking about someone's job. Many students are taught to say, "What do you do?" which is correct, but again, depending on your tone and body language, it might come across as too blunt or transactional.
A more tactful version would be, "So what kind of work are you involved in?" Or, "I'm always curious to hear what people do. May I ask what field you're in?" These questions feel more like invitations to share rather than demands for information.
And this applies just as much when you're seeking clarification. Think about how many times we want to understand something but end up sounding a bit aggressive by saying, "What do you mean?" or "What is that?" even if your intention is innocent. These questions can make the other person feel challenged or uncomfortable.
So instead, consider saying, Could you elaborate on that a little more? I want to make sure I understand your perspective, or I'm not familiar with that term. Would you mind explaining it a bit for me? You're still asking for clarity. But you're doing it with kindness and humility.
When it comes to personal questions, this is where cultural awareness really matters. In some countries, it's perfectly normal to ask, "How old are you?" or "Are you married?" to someone you just met, but in English-speaking cultures, especially in the West, these are considered quite personal, and asking them directly might create discomfort or awkwardness.
So if you really need to ask, for example in a friendly or informal setting, try saying, "I hope you don't mind me asking," and feel free not to answer. "But I was curious. Are you married?" This not only softens the question but also gives the listener an easy exit if they prefer not to share.
And the same goes for professional contexts. If you need to ask your manager something, avoid saying, "What should I do now?" which can sound like you're putting the responsibility on them. Instead, say something like, "Would you prefer that I focus on completing this task first? Or should I continue working on the earlier project?" Now you're still asking for guidance, but in a way that shows initiative and respect.
And when requesting help, don't just say, "Can you help me?" which again is a bit direct. Say, "Would it be all right if I asked for your help with something?" When you have a moment, you're still expressing your need, but with courtesy and consideration for their time.
This brings us to another point. Don't forget that tone and body language also play a role, no matter how polite your words are. If your voice sounds cold or rushed, the other person might still feel uncomfortable, so always try to keep your tone calm, warm, and relaxed.
And here's a powerful technique when you ask a series of questions. Especially in interviews, meetings, or social situations, it's always a good idea to end with a sentence like, "Thanks for bearing with all my questions. I really appreciate your help." This not only shows gratitude but also reminds the other person that you value their time and input.
Yes, and when you express that kind of appreciation, it creates a cycle of positive communication. People are more likely to want to talk to you again, answer your questions, and engage with you more deeply.
Now let's take a moment to consider one final but very important tip in English. Especially in formal or professional settings, indirectness is often seen as a sign of respect, not weakness. So when you ask something in an indirect way, you're actually being more polite, not less clear.
For example, instead of saying, "Can you repeat that?" you could say, "I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Would you mind repeating it one more time?" Or instead of, "Why didn't you tell me?" try, "I was just wondering if there was a reason I didn't hear about that earlier." These subtle shifts change the tone completely.
So to wrap up today's episode, remember this. Asking questions politely and naturally in English isn't about using fancy grammar or big vocabulary. It's about being thoughtful, respectful, and emotionally aware of how your words affect others.
That's right. And if you practice the techniques we discussed today, you'll not only sound more fluent, you'll also build better relationships, earn more trust, and feel more confident every time you open your mouth to ask something in English.
Thank you for joining us on this important episode. Keep listening, keep learning, and don't forget, the way you ask is just as important as what you ask.
Until next time, keep your English warm, polite, and human. See you soon.